Well, I want to next welcome another speaker from our partners at US EPA, and we're really very fortunate to have David Cozad joining us to kind of transition from Office of Air and Radiation to talk a little bit about some of the initiatives and priorities at the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, OECA. So David has been with the agency for 32 years and is currently on detail to EPA headquarters, where he's serving as OECA's Deputy Associate Administrator until an appointee is confirmed by the US Senate. When he's not on detail to headquarters, David has served as the first director of the Enforcement and Compliance Division at US EPA Region 7 in Kansas City. So David, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Please take it away.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And it's great being here. I assume you guys are going to put up my slides here. So I wish we were in person, and hopefully soon we can. But we'll, do the best we can here virtually, right? So the mere fact that all of you are here, that means you care about compliance, and I want to thank you for that. The people who I really need to be speaking to are the ones who aren't here. I'm going to apologize in advance. I've got a bit of a cough. I'm going to do the best I can here today. The good news for you as small business reps is that we have a lot of enforcement initiatives in this administration, and they are largely focused on larger sources and bigger problems. But there are some of our initiatives and focus areas that possibly do touch on small businesses, and we'll talk through that. Before we get into the priorities, a couple sort of opening things about where we are as an enforcement program overall. As you heard, we don't have a political appointee yet. David Ullman has been nominated to be the assistant administrator for OECA. His appointment has been waiting in the Senate for about a year now. It's not clear when he's going to get a full vote on the Senate floor. I think we're one of 3 EPA offices that doesn't have a political appointee confirmed yet. So I'm going to talk to you about our priorities as they are today. Whenever we do get a political appointee, he or she, may put their own touch on what our priorities are. Operationally, EPA is getting back into the office, but more importantly, we're getting back into the field. For the last 2 years, we've had a sharply reduced number of on-site inspections, but this spring and going into the summer, we're back full tilt doing on-site inspections. We tried a lot of things during the pandemic as to how we could do compliance monitoring in new and different ways through virtual inspections and information requests and document reviews. And we learned some things and found some things that worked really well that we're going to keep doing. But I think we also learned what we always suspected, that there is no substitute for boots on the ground, eyes on the facility, and on-site inspections. So we're glad we're going to be back in the field, full steam ahead. Next slide, please. And the reason we're really glad we're going to be back in the field is enforcement is a priority for this administration. This is a pretty busy slide, but I put it up there. It's in a nutshell, the agency's draft strategic plan for the next 4 years. And if you look over on the bottom row there, the third one over, goal 3 is about enforcement. And that's significant because in the prior administration's strategic plan issued in 2018, there was no goal for enforcement. And so I think it's very telling that in this administration's EPA strategic plan, one of the primary goals is enforcement of the law. Next slide, please. I said we have a lot of priorities. Here are the big ones. The first 2 are the biggest priorities of this administration when it comes to EPA overall and enforcement in general, and that is environmental justice and climate change. We also have national compliance initiatives. These are carryover from They were established in the last administration. They've carried over. There are 6 of them, and we'll talk about them in just a little bit. Lead is another enforcement priority. Coal combustion residuals. This is coal ash, landfills, and surface impoundments for coal ash. And then Pfas, which is a new and emerging priority. Couple things about this. So it's really 11 priorities. It's 6 national compliance initiatives plus 5 others. And that's a full plate for us, right? We have all the priorities we had in the last administration, plus some new ones. And in the new budget that EPA got, we don't have any new FTE for enforcement. So we're going to be doing all this work with the same amount of resources. So we're going to have to make smart choices about what we do and what we don't do. We're going to be looking for some sweet spots where there's overlap between these priorities. Let me give you a couple examples. Lead is oftentimes linked with environmental justice. So the enforcement of the TSCA lead paint rules, lead in drinking water, excess air emissions of lead. Those things often happen in overburdened and vulnerable communities. So that's kind of a sweet spot for us to look for violations. Illegal methane emissions from landfills or from oil and gas operations that impair air quality in overburdened communities, and also contribute to climate change. And that's part of our national air initiative as well. So there's a 3 for us. We're working on a national compliance initiative and addressing a potent greenhouse gas that's harming people in overburdened communities. A third example, facilities regulated in the 112R risk management program. They're handling large quantities of extremely hazardous substances, often located in overburdened communities, areas of EJ concern, and subject to extreme weather events if they're located in certain parts of the country due to climate change, which may make them more prone or more likely to have accidents and spills. So there's a place where if people don't have compliant risk management plans on how they're going to manage those chemicals and respond to accidents if they happen, you see an intersection of climate change and environmental justice and a national compliance initiative. So when I talk about us making smart choices, it's using our resources to try and advance these priorities in the smartest way we can. Next slide, please. All right, so let's dive into each one of these, starting with climate change, starting with environmental justice, because that's probably the biggest one for the enforcement world. Climate change, we can do some things around the margins in enforcement, but really that's, it's a global problem. It requires statutory or regulatory solutions, market-based solutions. Enforcement's not going to move the needle too much on climate. But in environmental justice, we can make a difference, right? We can go into communities that are overburdened and vulnerable. And if there is illegal pollution going on, we can stop it. And we can bring real relief to people who need it. And so it was very clear from the first week of this administration that this is a top priority for us. The president issued 2 executive orders that directly point to EPA when it comes to environmental justice, and specifically point to enforcement. I direct your attention to the right part of this slide, the executive order issued January 27th, that says specifically, the administrator of EPA shall strengthen enforcement of environmental violations with disproportionate impact on underserved communities through the Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance. I've been doing this work for 32 years, and the president has never spoken directly to me in my job like that. I've got clear direction from the White House on what I should be doing in my job with my enforcement responsibilities. Next slide, please. So similarly, when Michael Regan took office as the new administrator of EPA in April of 2021, in his first week on the job, he issued a memo to everybody in the agency about environmental justice, and part of it was directed at enforcement. And you'll see the part in bold there. Specifically, I direct all EPA offices to do the following: strengthen enforcement of violations of cornerstone environmental statutes and civil rights laws in communities overburdened by pollution. So the president and the administrator of EPA have made it clear to everybody at EPA who works on enforcement that we are to focus on enforcing the law in overburdened communities. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what that means and what we're going to do specifically, because we have a plan. And the first principle is that where there is ongoing serious harm due to a violation of the law, we're going to take quick action to stop that harm, probably quicker than we used to be. Almost all our statutes have emergency authorities in them that allow us to issue orders to stop ongoing violations and take action to prevent harm. And we've been using that more aggressively than we had in the past. We've issued 2 emergency orders under the Clean Air Act in the last year. That's opposed to issuing probably a dozen in the prior 50 years of the Clean Air Act. It's a tool we had not used much. It's one we're not going to hesitate to use now when we feel it's appropriate. One of those orders was to a refinery in the Virgin Islands. The other one was to a pulp and paperboard manufacturer in South Carolina. We've issued a number of emergency orders to deal with contaminated drinking water problems in systems large and small across the country that are mostly serving overburdened communities. So in the East St. Louis area, Clarksburg, West Virginia, Jackson, Mississippi, Benton Harbor, Michigan. Some of those had to do with lead. Some of them had to do with sewage getting in the drinking water. They all had in common is that, people couldn't rely on their drinking water to be safe, and immediate action needed to be taken to help them. And so we issued those orders. We also issued a couple of orders under Section 7003 of RCRA, one of them to an auto scrap facility, and the second to a hazardous waste storage and distribution facility. Both of those in Region 4. So early action is the first principle. When we see serious harm, we're not going to hesitate to step in and use our authorities to stop it. Next slide, please. Beyond that, we're trying to build consideration of environmental justice into our base program and everything that we do. And so there's really, when it comes to civil enforcement, 3 cornerstones to that. First one is we're going to put more of our boots on the ground, more of our inspections into overburdened communities. Second thing is where we do find violations, when we try to settle those cases, we're going to try to do it in ways that bring real benefits to communities. And the third is we're going to try to engage more with communities to see what they're concerned about. When we find violations, what would they like to see in terms of relief? We're going to try to engage with communities in some new and different ways than we have in the past. Next slide, please. So the first cornerstone there, increase inspections in overburdened communities. We've made a commitment as part of the government-wide Justice 40 initiative in this year to do at least 45 of our inspections in overburdened communities. That goes up to 50% next year and 55% in the years after. That's a significant, so half of our inspections basically we've committed we're going to do to advance the cause of environmental justice. So, what I would say to you and people you're advising is, figure out if your facility is located in an area that might be considered an area of environmental justice concern, because your chances of getting looked at by EPA go up significantly if that's where you are located. The second part of this, increasing our inspections, is putting together geographic initiatives, community-focused initiatives, where we go in with not just Clean Air Act inspectors, but Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, RCRA, lead paint, in a coordinated, well thought out way to look holistically at the problems being faced by a community that all evidence shows is overburdened by pollution and is socially vulnerable at the same time, and tackle the whole of the problem instead of doing one-off inspections. All the regions are putting together community initiatives. They're all doing it in a little different ways. My recommendation to you is whatever region you work with, you talk to them about what community initiatives they're thinking about, and learn more about their plans there. I'm going to give you an example of one of those initiatives here. Next slide, please. So the administrator last fall went on a tour in the Deep South. He called it the Journey to Justice Tour, where he traveled for a week or 10 days through Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, and literally sat on people's front porches in Cancer Alley and Jackson, Mississippi, and Port Arthur, Texas, and listened to people about what they were concerned about. And what are their environmental worries? And he got an earful. He heard a lot. He came back and we put together an action plan to follow up on what he heard. Part of that is an enforcement initiative that we're calling the Pollution Accountability Team, where we are sending in our mobile monitoring vehicle that does screening level measurements of air pollution. We have an airplane called the Aspect plane that does the same thing from above. And where that plane or that vehicle detect spikes, we're following up with on the ground inspectors. And so it's sort of a full phase, all the tools we have focused on finding out what are the real problems in these communities and what can we do about them. Next slide, please. So that picture on the left is what we call the GMAP vehicle. It's a tricked out van, basically, that can drive around and in real time get screening level measurements of VOCs, ethylene oxide, all the benzene, all those significant kinds of pollutants that communities are concerned about. And it creates a map of what it finds as it drives. And an illustration of that is on the right there. So if it's green, it means it's below levels of concern. As it was driving around, it didn't see anything there. If it's red, it's where we saw a spike that warrants some further investigation. And so this is a map of where we drove around in the roads inside a facility and saw where there's spikes, right? And so what we do when we see this kind of thing is then our inspectors, because these are huge facilities, know where to go in and focus their time. Next slide. And they go in with things like handheld infrared cameras, and they can pinpoint then where those spikes are coming from. You can see that cloud coming off that vent there. That's not visible with the naked eye, but with an infrared camera, you can see the VOC emissions venting off there. So it's how technology and pairing our tools together in smart ways enable us to really efficiently find where there are potential violations happening that are impacting communities. So almost all the regions are planning on using that GMAP vehicle in one way or another. We think it's a really efficient way to go into communities where there are a lot of different potential sources and find out which ones are a problem. Now, enforcement's not going to always be the solution. Some of those emissions are going to be perfectly legal. The problems might be in permitting, they might be in zoning, but at least we'll know, right? So we're going to use our tools and our inspectors to go in where there is a large burden of sources and find out what we can do about it. Next slide. You're probably wondering, what do we identify as an area of EJ concern? What do we consider a community with EJ issues? Fortunately, we have a really good tool called EJ Screen. You may be familiar with it. If not, I encourage you to play around with it. The link to it is on the bottom of this slide. You can go on there and plug in an address, and it will pull up a couple charts for you that are indexes based on 11 environmental indicators and 5 or 6 or 7 demographic indicators, and it looks at the data for each of those and compares it to the rest of the country, and tells you where you sit in terms of percentile. And it's things like violation of national ambient air quality standards, air toxics data, impaired water quality data, number of Superfund sites near the address, number of RCRA facilities near the address, number of risk management facilities near it, lead paint and housing stock indice. So it looks at that along with the social indicators such as income, education, whether it's linguistically isolated, life expectancy, asthma prevalence. And so if an index triggers at the 80th percentile or above nationally, that's our starting point for saying this is an area we might want to look more into, because it looks like it's got a high burden combined with some social vulnerability. So it's a really slick tool. It's not perfect. It doesn't do well with things like drinking water problems or other things. Even wastewater, it doesn't deal with terrifically, but it's very fine grained. It goes down to the census block level. So, it can tell us for a given neighborhood or a given community what it looks like for that area. And then we look beyond that. We talk in terms of where we know that tool falls short. Are there other things we ought to be considering? What we know just from our previous experience in that area and what the state has told us and what citizen tips are. So it's not the ending point for us saying this is an area of EJ concern, but it is a great way for us to get started. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the second cornerstone earlier, which is when we find violations, what we try to do about it. And what we're going to try and do is enter into settlements with people that look at innovative things we can do to help communities beyond just the facility paying a penalty and returning to compliance. Things like fence line monitoring, coupled with creation of a website where that data will get posted in real time, so that if you are a citizen that lives near a refinery or an ETO emitter, you can know what's happening on a real-time basis in your neighborhood, right? Or requiring periodic independent third-party audits of compliance, again, with transparency around that. So we're looking to try to do some innovative things that help communities beyond just returning to basic compliance and paying a penalty. Key to that is we just got a new tool back in our toolbox, Supplemental Environmental Projects. The Department of Justice announced the other day that they were returning that as a tool we can use. The prior administration had said those were illegal. EPA never agreed with that, but the prior Attorney General had decided that. This administration has rescinded that previous policy, and SEPs are now something we can again use to settle cases and as partial resolution of the penalty in that case, defendants can do projects that benefit the communities instead of paying cash to the Treasury. Next slide, please. And then I talked about more engagement with communities. And so a couple things we're doing. We have this thing called ECHO. It is our public database that has all our information about enforcement and inspections. Anybody can go on there and see what's going on in our community. But now you don't have to proactively do it. You can sign up and get notice whenever there's been a new enforcement action or a new inspection in your neighborhood or your zip code. So it's a listserv kind of thing. We think it's a real great thing for citizens to be able to do, is to sign up to be able to find out through periodic notices from us what's going on in your community. We're doing the same thing with Nextdoor with respect to our criminal program. When there's been criminal activity, environmental criminal activity in your area, we're going to do a shout out through Nextdoor and let people know that. So we're trying to do some innovative things to make our information about enforcement more accessible to people. Next slide, please.
Hey, David, this is Chris. I just want to give you a 5-minute warning. So if you want
Okay,
time for questions.
let's skip this. Yeah, I'm going to blow through a couple more things. Next slide, please. So here's the national compliance initiatives. There's nothing new in these. The ones that are most applicable to small businesses are potentially the 112R. If you are regulated by that, that remains an initiative. We are going to be focusing on where that overlaps with environmental justice. So if you have a risk management plan and you're in an overburdened community, be ready. Mobile source aftermarket defeat devices. So auto shops that are selling or installing defeat devices continue to be a target for us. And those are often small businesses. And then creating cleaner air for communities. So while we're going to be mostly focused on large things like refineries, if we go in with those GMAP vehicles and find things like dry cleaners or auto shops or small manufacturers that are putting illegal excess emissions into communities, we may be more prone to be looking at those than we have in the past. Importantly, we're going to be looking at what the next round of national compliance initiatives is this summer. And so that would be an important point of engagement for you and your group. We'll be seeking public comment on that. And I encourage you to put input when we do that. Next slide, please. Real quick on climate change, HFCs. So like methane, hydrofluorocarbons are a really potent greenhouse gas. There's a new law in the United States that calls for the phase down of those, including a lockdown on imports. And as it becomes harder to find those domestically, the illegal import of those is likely to become more common. We set up a new task force with Customs and Border Patrol, where EPA and Customs are going to be enforcing that phase down and shutdown of imports. And we're already seeing successful results from that. This is where we can make a real difference in climate change. These things are like 25 to 40 times more potent than CO2. Next slide, please. CCR, this one's not likely to touch small businesses, but it's a big deal for us. There's about 750 coal combustion units across the country that have to close. We want to make sure they do it properly. Our early indications are that a lot of the units are not being closed properly. So we've probably got a decade's worth of work ahead of us working to get all these units properly closed through enforcement orders. I wouldn't be shocked if there's litigation around this too. Next slide, please. And then the last thing I want to touch on here is PFAS, which is the new and emerging thing. There's a whole regulatory agenda that's been announced, the PFAS roadmap. So drinking water standards, regulation as a hazardous substance, fluent guidelines, that's all coming, but it's a couple of years away. And until then, people who live downwind and downstream from these major PFAS manufacturers potentially have real health threats due to PFAS in their drinking water, in the soils where they garden, et cetera. And so we're launching an initiative to look at those facilities in and around the major PFAS manufacturers. And we'll be doing sampling and then addressing threats as we find them. Next slide, please. Last thing I'll touch on is, what we're doing in our inspection practice, because it's a little different than we've been doing during COVID. During COVID, as I said, we were doing a lot of remote stuff. We're back in person now. We were also announcing all our inspections ahead of time in COVID, so we could talk through what barriers to entry there might be and that kind of thing. We're now going back to unannounced inspections where we show up and expect to be let in. We do have a goal of getting inspection reports out to businesses within 70 days of the inspection. It's just bad government if we inspect you and you don't hear from us for a long time. And so our internal goal is from the inspection to you getting a report is 70 days or less. And we're pretty successful in doing that about 90% of the time, which is a big improvement for us. We didn't used to be that great at this part of our job. And then we're developing what we're calling smart tablets for all our programs, where to just make our inspections more efficient, where we've got checklists loaded on tablets that our inspectors have, where they can walk around and do that and then generate a report that we get real quickly right away, and it's consistent across all the regions. And I think that's all I had in this rapid fire enforcement thing. There's some resources for you on there. You know, with 11 different priorities, it's hard to cover them in 30 minutes. You can notice I spent most of my time on environmental justice because that's where most of the action is. That's where enforcement can probably do the most to advance this administration's priorities. I don't know if I have time for a few questions. If so, I'm happy to answer them. Or I will also be happy if anybody wants to call me or email me individually afterwards to deal with things that way.
We do have a few questions. Chris, do we have time?
Yeah, let's take one or two.
All right, so we'll take them in order because Jennifer has made a comment and has a question. She said in Michigan, they've been working on with EPA Region 5 on all types of inspection community initiatives. David is speaking of recently, it has been very interesting in getting things done. One of the things I'm interested in is emergency provisions of the Clean Air Act. This has been the scope of small businesses, but we hear from communities, can't you shut them down? Sounds like EPA can in cases. I would like to know more about that.
Sure. So, you know, I highlighted for you two recent examples where we did that. One was a refinery in the Virgin Islands that was literally raining oil down on the neighborhood around it. The other was a paper plant in South Carolina where we had over 1,000 citizen complaints. It's an authority we have. Like I said, it's one we have rarely used in the past. If EPA issues an order to a facility under the Clean Air Act, that order is only good for 60 days unless we go to court with the Department of Justice and a court agrees the order should be extended. So that's one of the limitations we have on that authority. That limitation doesn't exist in our other statutes. It's one we're not afraid to use, but we don't want to abuse it either. Like shutting down a business is a serious thing. We want to make sure that we've got the evidence to show that there is serious ongoing harm to the community that warrants the kind of relief such as the temporary closure of a business while it installs controls. So I think it's one we're looking to use more than we have in the past, but you know, we're always going to be careful that the facts warrant its use.
Her follow-up is that additionally, this part of the act does not help state agencies prevent installation in EJ communities that are already overburdened if we do not have a state rule allowing that. Is David's office looking into more guidance for states on this?
I'm not sure I understand that question. Maybe it's better if I follow up with that questioner afterwards.
Sure. And I think it pertains to limiting where companies who have overburdened other communities in the past could then place their businesses.
Yeah.
So literally be limiting.
EPA has not a large role in citing. You know, we have the ability, and when we do, it's through the permitting process. Enforcement's only going to get involved once a place is up and running, right? So those kind of concerns are more local in nature through zoning and state permitting, and then EPA oversight of the state permitting. But she does get into a really important issue of cumulative burden, right? And the fact that sometimes there's multiple facilities in one area, and what should we do about that? And that's something the agency's wrestling with, and environmental justice advocates are wrestling with, and it's an important but difficult problem.
The other question has to do with the GMAP. I thought that technology and then the map that it creates was obviously very, very helpful. Is that going to be available to publics, or will that go through your ECHO?
Yeah, so we've committed to the communities that we drove through on that Journey to Justice tour that we would make the GMAP information available to them. It takes us a little bit of time to QA it and get it in a publicly releasable format. So we don't release it like instantaneously, but we are going to make it all public, probably on the Region 6 website. Similarly, that stuff always ends up in an inspection report, and usually I think we're committed to making that information public. Yeah, we have to be careful when we do it that we give it context, because it's not evidence level data, it's screening level data, right? It points us to where there might be a problem and where we ought to take a closer, harder look. It's not something that shows you, oh, that's a violation. It tells you, oh, there might be a violation there. You better go look.
Okay,
All right.
great. Go ahead.
All right, thanks, Nancy. And David, I think this is probably a quick one. Is there a list of overburdened communities considered by each individual EPA region? Is that where you would direct people to folks like to something like the EJ screen?
No, there's no list like that, because there's not a hard, bright line definition of what is an area of EJ concern. It's sort of a subjective thing, based on which circumstances in individual communities. But EJ screen will give you a good indication of how we might look at a given address. So you can go into EJ screen, plug in the address of your facility, and you'll see for the different indexes, are you in the 80th percentile or above for those? And if so, there's a decent chance EPA would, at least as a starting matter, say, yeah, that's an area of potential EJ concern. Okay.
All right. Well, David,
the website on EJ screen is very user friendly, and it's very helpful in explaining the tool, because it's meant to be a public tool. And so, I'd encourage you guys to play around with it. It's fascinating both from a business level, but also just where you live, right? Your own individual life and what's around you. So it's a great tool.
well, thank you. Thanks for the highlight on that. And also, thanks for the great presentation. I know you were struggling a little bit with your cough, and thank you. We really appreciate you making it on to join us today. I know you kind of overcame some obstacles there.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm bouncing back. So.
All right, good to hear.